Ooh, ooh, ooh. Sometimes in our lives we all have pain, we all have sorrow, but if we are wise, we know that there's...
Let the revolution begin. There may be no more important election in our lifetime than the one that will take place on November 3rd, 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic has ripped the cover off the facade of a civilized, highly functioning democracy of, by, and for the people. Under that cover are lies, deceptions, and distortions of the deeply flawed but grand intent of the framers and fathers of our nation. They were simply men, not truly fathers, whose care would have enveloped all the people. And while they created the institutions and wrote the laws that governed our nation, essential workers tilled the land, built the infrastructure, laid the railroad tracks, taught the children, cared for the ill and the elderly, labored in the factories and the processing plants that created the wealth enjoyed by fewer and fewer of the people as the decades and the centuries have passed. And the franchise, the right and power of one citizen, one vote, is again under attack, selectively denied to the made poor and the kept poor, denied to black and brown citizens, denied to students and the elderly in unfavored districts, denied to dreamers of all kinds, as if the vote were a privilege bestowed upon the chosen. To that we say no. The vote is for all. So welcome to voting and voter suppression in the age of COVID. The Riverside Church is proud to join with our friends Justice Aid in presenting this public forum on voter suppression to help us prepare and engage in restoring to every deserving person this right of citizenship. I am Michael Livingston, the interim senior minister at the Riverside Church in the city of New York. Welcome.
Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chasing rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place that star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Justice Aid is deeply honored to partner with Riverside Church and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights to spotlight racist voter suppression in this forum. America was founded in genocide. America has just witnessed, the world has just witnessed the murder of George Floyd. This comes on the heels of over 400 years of slavery and its legacies, over hundreds of years of oppression of people of color. We have just witnessed the largest demonstrations, the largest civil rights demonstrations the world has ever seen. Jean-Baptiste said that apathy will be on the ballot this November. 100 million people didn't vote in the last national election. We need to channel all the energy of these recent demonstrations to get every possible person to vote. Every person who has stood up to change the system to come out and vote. This is an opportunity to change the world forever. Thank you.
It won't be long till I'm gonna need somebody to lean on.
Hi, I'm Kim Coaxum, and today I have the distinct honor of introducing a longtime and tireless champion of free and fair elections, Ms. Stacey Abrams. Prior to her historic run for governor of Georgia as a Democratic nominee in 2018, Stacey served 13 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 of those as the minority leader. Stacey is also the founder of Fair Fight, a not-for-profit dedicated to fighting against systemic voter suppression in all of its forms, whether it's illegal voter purges or poll closures in low-income and minority neighborhoods or excessively long lines to vote, which in this day of COVID-19 can be life-threatening. I'm proud to say that, like myself, Stacey is also an Atlantan and a proud HBCU alum. Justice Aid and Riverside Church welcome Stacey Abrams.
Hello, I'm Stacey Abrams. I hope you and your loved ones remain safe and healthy during this time. Though we cannot be together in person, I am deeply inspired by Justice Aid's continuous fight against injustice and inequality during these challenging times. COVID-19 has put into sharp relief how failed policies exacerbate those inequalities for marginalized communities and constantly highlight the differences between those who get help when they need it most and those who get left behind. We can and must do better. This starts by electing leaders who represent our values and our people. COVID-19 poses deadly risks to the health of our nation's citizens and devastating harm to our economy. But if we do not act, it threatens our very democracy as well. With the stakes so high in 2020, we cannot afford to have our votes taken from us. And no one should be forced to choose between staying safe and participating in our democracy. Across the country, cynical Americans have worked tirelessly to prevent safer alternatives to voting in 2020. They do not want you to vote because they know that when we overwhelm the system with our voices, we win. I launched Fair Fight 2020 in August 2019 to combat voter suppression across the country in all its forms and to build voter protection infrastructure early. But we cannot do it alone, which is why I'm thrilled that Justice Aid's 2020 beneficiary is Election Protection, the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection coalition. It was formed to ensure that all voters have an equal opportunity to participate in the process. Now more than ever, voters deserve to have a greater say in the political process, but we also need to ensure that they remain safe while casting their ballots. That's where you all come in. You're warriors in the fight for democracy, armed with the creed that every eligible voter has the right to make their voices heard. Your courageous efforts are necessary in the righteous pursuit of freedom. We need you and those in your communities to demand leaders who serve the common good by voting. And we must hold our elected officials accountable every day. In these times of extreme partisanship, it is time our elected leaders get back into the business of peopleship by focusing on the needs, hopes, and dreams of every American, regardless of difference. We each have a role to play, and when we come together, we are unstoppable. Let's use our voices to ensure greater access to our democracy and guarantee a better tomorrow for future generations. Thank you, Justice Aid, and let's get it done.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcia Johnson Blanco. I co-direct the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where I oversee the work of the Election Protection Coalition. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. Congressman Jeffries is currently serving in his fourth term representing the 8th Congressional District of New York, which includes parts of Brooklyn and Queens. He serves on the House Judiciary and Budget Committees and is chair of the House Democratic Caucus. Congressman Jeffries uses a bipartisan approach to governing and is focused on social and economic issues. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Jeffries.
Let me begin by thanking Justice Aid, as well as the Mission and Social Justice Commission of the historic Riverside Church, for extending this invitation to me and for the work that you do in connection with social, racial, and economic justice throughout America. We are in the midst of a deadly COVID-19 pandemic, both a public health crisis and an economic crisis that has brought pain, suffering, and death to America, particularly historically disadvantaged communities of color. It is made clear that leadership matters, governance matters, voting matters, particularly in the midst of a storm. This country was founded on high ideals, like checks and balances, separate and co-equal branches of government, the independent judiciary, the free and fair press, the preeminence of the rule of law, and the principle of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But if in fact we are going to bring that principle to life, then we have to ensure that every single American has the right to freely and fairly vote and participate in our democracy. We know that has historically not always been the case. And that is why patriots rose up in the 1960s to ensure passage of the historic Voting Rights Act that was ultimately signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. We're thankful for leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, John Lewis, and so many others, as well as Democrats and Republicans who joined together as Americans to pass that legislation. It's interesting that in every single reauthorization subsequent to that moment of the Voting Rights Act, it was signed back into law by a Republican president. 1970, Richard Nixon. 1975, Gerald Ford. 1982, Ronald Reagan. 2006, George W. Bush. For a period of time in America, participating in our democracy was not viewed through a partisan political lens. But everything seemingly changed in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States of America. Historians will have to determine why, in fact, that is the case. But the facts are clear. In the aftermath of President Obama's election, more than 40 different states introduced more than 180 different voter suppression laws, many of which were ultimately enacted as a result of the 2013 Supreme Court decision that gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It's now, in fact, the case that some people on the other side of the aisle view voter suppression as a necessary electoral tactic in order to maintain power or acquire additional representation. That is shameful. And that is why we must all proceed with the fierce urgency of now, particularly in the midst of this pandemic, to ensure that every single American has the opportunity to vote at home and vote by mail. We must ensure that every single American has an opportunity to participate in early voting and to ensure that there are sufficient poll sites on Election Day so that people can vote safely and vote conveniently. No American should be forced to choose between their health, safety, and well-being on the one hand and participating and exercising their constitutional right to vote on the other. This is America. This is a democracy. This is a country that is anchored in the principle of self-government, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so we must engage in the effort to combat voter suppression with the fierce urgency of now, as if our life depends on it, because the quality of life of every single American absolutely depends on their ability to freely and fairly participate in our democracy. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your efforts. God bless Justice Aid. God bless the Riverside Church. And God bless the United States of America.
One of the greatest influences in my life has been my great-grandfather, Luther Craig Worthy. Much of my childhood was spent just visiting him and just sitting at his feet listening to him tell stories. He was born in 1906, roughly 40 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he passed away in 2011, so he lived to be 105 years old. So he had a lot of stories. What was interesting is that as a teenager, and even well into his 20s, he personally knew a few individuals who had experienced the horror of slavery. Also, when he was my age, under the law in Texas, he was not allowed to vote. It wasn't until he was almost 60 years old that we had the passage of the Voting Rights Act that enabled him to vote. And since that point, he never missed another election. Each election that I'm eligible to vote in, I always think of him when I'm sitting in the poll booth. My great-grandfather, Luther Craig Worthy, is the reason I vote. Thank you.
I vote because I want to eradicate the sin of racism that permeates every fabric of our society. I vote because in my lifetime, I want a beloved country that honors the human dignity of all its people, where the heart-wrenching cry, "I can't breathe," will be heard no more.
I vote to use my voice, as it's one of the most peaceful ways of use of my power as an American citizen. It allows me to express thoughts on all sorts of issues: climate change, education, fairness to all people. But most importantly, I respect those who came before me and fought for this right.
It is my right, obligation, and duty to vote in every election, because the right to vote was hard-won, and I feel I owed it to the people, some of whom never got the opportunity to vote, and some who died.
I knew that I could vote and that wasn't a privilege, it was my right. Every time I tried, I was shot, killed, jailed, beaten.
We were surrounded by men with billy clubs.
We were actually in a war, except that one camp was unarmed.
No democracy can stand if rule is based on unjust law.
We face a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise.
In 1963, President Kennedy called on the nation's legal professionals to roll up their sleeves and fight for civil rights. The response was vigorous, and the Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights was born.
Many are denied equal treatment, but it cannot continue.
From the beginning, the protection of voting rights has been paramount.
Voting rights serve as the conduit through which all other change is made possible.
What's going on this morning?
Well, we've got, it looks like a margin for George W. Bush of somewhere around a little bit less than 800 votes.
The civil rights community and the voting rights community looked on with some horror as voters were stopped from being able to cast a ballot.
What's at stake here, and people need to know this, is that elections are being stolen.
A 2013 Supreme Court decision made their work more complex and more crucial as the court struck down a key protection of the Voting Rights Act.
The same day, the state of North Carolina passed a new law that a court later described was enacted with surgical precision to discriminate against the rights of African Americans in voting.
This voter ID law is primarily going to affect students and poor people of color.
In many states, strict voter ID laws, closing of polling places, and removal of registered voters from the voter rolls have all been part of a campaign against the most vulnerable Americans trying to exercise their most basic democratic right.
We have seen widespread and rampant voter suppression efforts at the local and state level in many communities across the country. This is a season where we see officials really erecting unnecessary and burdensome hurdles and barriers to make it harder for Americans to have their voice heard on Election Day.
Decades of voter suppression have led to voter disengagement, especially among many young voters who fear that voting is futile.
If your vote doesn't matter, why are they working so damn hard to suppress it?
Lower voter turnout may be wildly exacerbated by pandemic fears and restrictions. Our elections and our democracy may be more imperiled than ever in our history.
This is Teresa Steiner, Justice Aid board member, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for our panel on voting and voter suppression, Ray Suarez. During his 30-year career as a broadcast journalist and news anchor, Ray hosted programs on Al Jazeera America, PBS, CNN, and NPR. As senior national correspondent on the PBS NewsHour, he covered global health, the 9/11 attacks, 4 presidential elections, and 2 presidential debates. He's a multi-award winner and co-recipient of the DuPont Columbia Silver Baton Award for his reporting on the first democratic election in South Africa in 1994.
Thank you, Teresa, for inviting me to moderate this session. The ability of a legally qualified American to cast a vote is a part of civic life that you might have wished we wouldn't have to argue about too much 55 years after the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965 with overwhelming majorities in the House and Senate and President Johnson's signature a short time later. But here we are, with a core right of citizenship again fiercely contested territory, with preclearance stripped from the Voting Rights Act, widespread voter purges, manipulation of the location and staffing of polling places, and now, for 2020, in a country plagued by coronavirus, a battle royale brewing over the use of mail-in ballots. We're a universe away from literacy laws targeting Black voters, poll taxes, or demands to guess how many marbles are in a big jar. the battles can be more subtle, more complex, and arguably, in a country in the midst of demographic change, more far-reaching in their impact as they've ever been. Or sometimes the same old brute force manipulation that led to the Voting Rights Act in the first place is in evidence. Majority Latino Dodge City, Kansas, struggled with just one polling place for its 13,000 residents. And then, in the 2018 midterm elections, Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach moved Dodge's only polling place out of town, far from the residential areas inside the city limits. When a majority of justices on Wisconsin's Supreme Court ruled the state's primary had to go ahead as the pandemic really began to bite, the state's largest city, Milwaukee, saw its usual 180 polling places reduced to 5 for its 600,000 citizens. Therese mentioned I covered South Africa's first free elections. I waited with black voters for hours in lines on Election Day as the polls were overwhelmed with first-time voters. It is bizarre, 25 years later, in the United States, to see how routine it's become for black and brown voters and others to wait for hours to vote, as poll workers frantically petition to keep polling places open past their designated closing time. Something's up, and the fight is a high-stakes one. For this discussion on voter suppression and voter rights, I'm joined by two supremely experienced guests. Kristen Clarke, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and Maria Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino. Maria Teresa and Kristen, let me begin with the most basic, perhaps the cornerstone question. If you're an American citizen, 18 years old, and not otherwise encumbered by any legal disqualification, is it harder to cast a vote in the U.S. today and have some confidence it will be properly tabulated than it was in 1990 or 1980? Kristen?
The right to vote is hotly contested. It is now and has always been, and the battle surrounding access to the franchise has been a really intense one. It is harder to access the ballot today, depending on who you are and where you live and how poor you are. The Supreme Court issued a devastating decision in 2013 in a case called Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. That case literally cut out the heart of the Voting Rights Act and brought to a grinding halt a core provision of the act that required that certain cities and states in parts of our country with very long histories of discrimination get federal review of their voting changes before they could be put in place. So before they could put in place a new photo ID law or make a decision to shut down polling sites or redraw district lines, all of those changes were subject to federal review. And that federal review process did a lot of work, a lot of important work, and blocked hundreds of discriminatory voting changes in our country. The 2013 Supreme Court ruling has opened up the floodgates to voter suppression because we don't have that federal kind of gate check in place anymore. And we're fighting tooth and nail against relentless waves of voter suppression. Sadly, we have a president in the White House who makes statements that often fans those flames more intensely. And here's the other reality. Elections in our country come down to very close margins. And you peel off a few people here and a few voters there, and all of a sudden voter suppression can change the outcome of an election. Here we are in 2020. The right to vote remains hotly contested today. And we have a lot of important work to do to make sure that everyone has voice in our democracy this season.
Maria Teresa, same question. And because you've been so active enrolling voters, registering voters, maybe you could also talk a little bit about whether it's harder to become a voter in the first place.
So one of the biggest challenges in the work that we do is informing the voter of their right to vote and to participate. It's not shocking that the fact that only 8 out of 50 states require civic education in order to graduate from high school, that you have a whole group of young, new, first generation voters that have no idea how to navigate this program. They have no idea that it's as easy as going to your DMV or to going to votolatino.org or going to your Secretary of State's to register to vote. But that is part of the strategy. Part of the strategy of preventing the vote is to make it sound opaque, really scary, that you're not part of the system, that you're not wanted in the system. And so what we do at Voto Latino every day is to encourage people to say, this is your power. This was something that you earned, and this is something that it's the crux of our democracy. Shelby County against Eric Holder gutted the Voting Rights Act because it was preparing for 2020. And what I mean by that, Ray, is that in 2013, you saw a whole bunch of Republican state houses reading the census reports of 2010, where we discovered, you didn't because you've been on this beat long enough, didn't discover, but America discovered that 51% of our nation's population growth was the children of Hispanic parents. They knew that in 2020, you were going to have the second largest voting bloc aging into the population. So when you look at the demographics of Shelby County had over 100% growth in Latino population. The 22 jurisdictions that followed of gutting the Voting Rights Act, of preventing the vote, of moving voting places, of actually creating all of these new rules, had at least a 30% increase in the Latino population. They weren't old enough to vote quite yet, but this year, for the very first time, you're going to have the second largest voting population that happened to be Latino. The majority of whites in this country are 54. The majority of Latinos are 19 years old. 4 million of them who will be able to cast a ballot for the very first time. So this purge and attack on the voting rights is disproportionately on the shoulders of not just young Latinos, but African Americans and young people in general. This election marks the very first time that the young population will be larger by 12 million more voters than baby boomers. So this was preparation. And I think what is shocking more is that there was not preparation of safeguarding our elections soon enough by other people reading the exact same tea leaves. And so what our job is to make sure that we say at Voto Latinos that it's important for people to understand their rights, to also understand how do they inform themselves, make sure that they have the proper ID, because as Kristen's group, the Lawyers Committee, takes people to task, takes them to court to fight all these terrible laws, we need an informed public, because yes, there are people trying to prevent your vote, but our job is to make sure that you are as informed as possible because we need you to show up.
Kristen, your organization has been at this for a long time. Have the battles shifted? Have the strategies and tactics changed? Or are we talking about sort of raw voter suppression techniques that would not be unfamiliar to people who were trying them out in the 40s and 50s?
Yeah. So we have to acknowledge that we've seen progress since the 1960s. The Voting Rights Act was adopted in 1965, our most important federal civil rights law. And it's done tremendous work. And the reason why we have so many African Americans and Latinos sitting in Congress today, vis-a-vis the 1960s, is because of the Voting Rights Act and because of the work of people who have fought for decades, like John Lewis, fearlessly for the right to vote. But sadly, a lot of the voter suppression that we see today often kind of bears the stench of measures that you'd expect to see back in the Jim Crow era. I'll give you an example. State of Tennessee has one of the lowest voter registration rates in the country. Activists and churches go to work to reach low-income people who are not yet onto the rolls. They knock on doors, they do targeted mailings, they do community events, and they registered tens of thousands of people who voted for the first time in 2018. What did the state legislature do a year later? They adopted a law that imposes criminal penalties and fines on groups, third-party groups that register people to vote. And this was a law that was all about having a chilling effect on those exact same groups that were out there doing this important work. We were able to successfully beat back the state's efforts in the courts, but it's just a reminder that while we've made progress, the progress is fragile, and it's really important that we remain on alert, that we sound an alarm, that we be vigilant about the changes that are happening in our communities and in our states, that we use our voice to speak up, that the lawyers turn to the courts to mount battles when appropriate, that people are out marching in the streets. It's going to take that kind of a full court press to make sure that everyone has voice in our democracy. Georgia, this is another state that's been ground zero when it comes to voter suppression. Macon-Bibb County, this is a place where they sought to move a polling site from a majority Black school to a local sheriff's office. And the community pushed back and said, look, this is not a place where people are going to feel comfortable and free being able to vote. Officials resisted, and so we partnered with the community, and we were able to ultimately beat back that effort and got that polling site moved to a Black church. All of these are examples of the kinds of tactics and schemes that you would expect to see in the 60s. And, again, while we've traveled a great way, we still have a long way to go to make sure everyone has voice in our democracy. And who is targeted? It's African Americans, it's Latinos, and Voto Latino has been doing such a tremendous job in that regard to register people to make sure that they're able to have voice in our democracy. It's students, it's poor people. And so at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and across the civil rights community at large, we're about fighting for those voices on the margins, those people on the margins who are so often locked out and excluded and easy targets and prey for these voter suppression schemes. The cases that we bring, the advocacy that we mount, is about making sure that nobody is left behind and that everybody is able to have voice on Election Day.
Maria Teresa, various elected officials, most particularly coming from one of our two major parties, have been sounding the alarm in recent months with greater and greater urgency that there's a risk of widespread voter fraud in 2020. And to prevent it, they're now recruiting some 50,000 volunteers to act as poll watchers in key battleground states. They are so far clearing the legal hurdles that have been put up in earlier elections to prevent them from doing this. Their answer is all they want is a level playing field with the other party on this score. What's the harm? What should people know about this?
So, Ray, this was actually a policy that had been put in place about 15 years ago in the 1990s, and sadly it expired about 3 years ago, and we're going to be experiencing for the very first time. It was put in place, it was basically safeguarding people coming in and bullying individuals and intimidating individuals from casting a ballot. You will hear of instances where police officers come in and they're no longer they're wearing their uniform, but they're off duty, intimidating individuals. You have individuals basically trying to bust people from participating. It's an intimidation tactic, pure and simple. I can tell you that Voto Latino, we were part of an action in Texas because on Election Day last time around, there was ICE exercises two blocks down from a polling place at a local high school. That's an intimidation tactic. And so one of the things that Voto Latino has done is that first of all, we endorsed Amy Klobuchar's $4 billion bill to protect the vote come November. It's now part of the HEROES Act, and we're actively encouraging the Senate to pass it. In it, it provides uniform playing rules for everyone. It provides the information and the more than importantly, the investment that in the infrastructure that is needed in order for states to play by uniform laws. But it also provides provisions so that they can have a whole new generation of poll workers. We believe that if you have a young person from their local community that is actually overseeing those election protections, it ensures that the person does not only feel intimidated, but empowered. It's hard for me not to emphasize enough the fact that in our democracy, politicians should be fighting for our vote. We are highly competitive as Americans, but this is the only place where people cower to actually try to get someone to participate and to vote for them. We should be battling about ideas, not about who is representing themselves at the poll. rules. And our job, whether we're talking about the lawyers community, where we're talking about individual citizens, where we're talking about journalists such as yourself, is not only exposing these fundamental structural impediments to participating, but also providing people with the information so that they feel that they empowered. Because when people participate, we actually see extraordinary change.
But the pushback, and I'm sure you've heard the pushback,
of course,
comes from people who say, well, if you're a legally qualified voter and you're supposed to be in that polling place and fully empowered to cast a vote, you have nothing to fear from a poll watcher, from an ICE action. Why would you be afraid for an ICE action if you're a legally qualified citizen who's able to vote? Perhaps seriously, perhaps disingenuously, others will comment, not me. They say, look, people who are able to vote would have nothing to fear from these volunteer poll watchers, from these party activists, from officers from other law enforcement agencies who are in the polling place or near the polling place. What's the problem, they say?
The challenge is that it's not an active ability for someone to encourage them to come and vote. It's the presence of intimidation. And when you are approaching as a first-time voter and you see someone that starts also not just standing there and staring at you, but then also starts sharing in false information. So, for example, you mentioned what is the harm of someone that's kind of thuggish looking, saying that intimidates you. They may also say, well, you know what? If you have not paid your electricity bill, then you cannot vote. That is not true. So what happens is that in these voter registration taxes, when you have an intimidating looking person, and it's the very first time that you're participating, it's also the language and the talking points in which they are prepped with that ensures someone that feels that they cannot participate. In the Latino community right now, there is so much fear of mixed status families that anything that you do as a legal resident and as a U.S. citizen, that you could expose yourself and your loved ones, actually prevents people from participating. In the 2018 election, there were flyers being sent to mixed status households in Latino neighborhoods saying that if you had a loved one that was undocumented, then you could not cast a ballot. That's simply not true. You reinforce that then with someone that is doing ICE exercises, that is racially profiling you, with the fact that you might be accidentally, just for simply being brown, accidentally be tied up in an ICE ring. You're trying to challenge yourself, like, is my vote worth it? If all of a sudden I can find myself as a U.S. citizen accidentally processed in a detention facility, because these are all true stories. And so we need to make sure that we're diligent. We need to make sure that we have the right protection. And sadly, you mentioned being part of a delegation that saw oversight in the South African elections. Sadly, it's getting to the point that we're going to have to provide some sort of free election protections as well in those types of oversights.
Kristen, Clarke, as the arguments, the battles, the debates are now shifting to the remaining primaries, the effects of the pandemic, and mail-in ballots for the general election, are we likely to see critical issues now fought out not in legislatures, but in court? And in 5.5 months, is there time to litigate all of this when there are 50 states and thousands of counties?
We are not going to give up. We will continue to fight until the bitter end to make sure that everyone who seeks to exercise voice in our democracy in 2020 is able to do so. And as you know, there is a fair amount of litigation playing out in courts across the country. And I think that opponents know this and are exploiting that fact, filing baseless litigation that they expect will kind of run the clock and may impede access for voters. But we're going to do what's right and just and stand up for the right to vote. California is an example of a place where Governor Newsom took the very bold and proactive move of automatically sending absentee ballots to eligible voters in that state. That makes a lot of sense. There is a pandemic that has gripped the nation, and people are dying and people are fearful of this disease, which is easily transmitted. We also know that in California, that the vast majority, over 60% of those who have sadly lost their lives are people of color, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans. Governor Newsom's action makes sense, makes bold sense in this context, particularly because there are numerous states all across the country that have put in place vote by mail and have done so successfully, securely. and have done so with bipartisan support. That said, this past weekend, just a few days ago, there was litigation challenging the governor's proactive move here, which kind of puts voters in a state of limbo. For now, for the present time being, people should continue to, exercise their right to vote by absentee ballot if that's what they choose. And, these kinds of battles are playing out, sadly, all across the country. We're involved in a number of these cases. There are people who are exploiting this pandemic as another way to, again, promote voter suppression. And it's just incredibly unfortunate. Vote by mail has long been a part of the American experience of voting in our country. In fact, military voters used to cast absentee ballots dating back to the Civil War. This is not new. It's just something that's incredibly necessary because of the novel pandemic that has hit the nation, because people are dying, because people are quarantined, because there are stay-at-home orders. What else can we do? It's really important that we fight to give people that option, that avenue to exercise their right to vote. Alongside that, though, I just want to say that we're still also fighting for expanded early voting opportunities and for in-person voting opportunities on Election Day. Because we know that for some communities, that experience of going out and voting in person is an important one. And so whatever avenue people choose is their prerogative, but we are going to fight to make sure that there are as many avenues as possible for people during this unprecedented season that we're in.
Maria Teresa, you've been involved in messaging and voter education for so long. I'm wondering how much of this is kind of an air war, an information war. If you go on TV in a state where there's a debate about mail-in balloting, and you talk about fraud, and you talk about chicanery, and you talk about people trying to wreck the process, do you sow doubt, even if mail ballots are going to go ahead, and even if there's not even going to be an effective challenge, do you create confusion that can be depending on what you're trying to accomplish, that can be useful? Is that part of the battle as well? Just making confusion, second thoughts, insecurity about what you're going ahead and trying to do.
Ray, I'm glad that you brought this up because this is not enough part of the discourse. There is a real misinformation, disinformation campaign that is part of strategy. That is part of it preventing people to their participation. It basically says that both sides are the same. It basically says that things are too hard. Maybe there is voter fraud. Maybe I shouldn't participate. But let's be clear. Voting by mail has been part of a long history among many states. This is not new. The president and his family all vote by mail. We have to make sure that we have safeguards in place so that everybody's vote can count if they choose to exercise a vote by mail. What I mean by that is that in Florida, young people who voted by mail, young people, African Americans, the poor, their ballots, 5.5% of their ballots were thrown out compared to older Americans in Florida who basically less than 1% of those ballots were thrown out. So we need to make sure that with vote by mail that there is a level playing field, that everyone is playing by the same rules. We should encourage the government either to provide free postage or prepaid postage for mail-in ballots. We have to make sure that people throw out signature matches because oftentimes, Ray, I can go into the grocery store and I could sign my credit card one way, but then I can sign my taxes another way. So let's be honest. What are preventing people from making sure that they're qualifying from the ballot? I would also make sure that we have to be able to ensure that there is a postmark date on election day to count the ballot. Right now, Voto Latino has a lawsuit in front of Arizona because Arizona, you can go ahead and be a great citizen and register and actually cast your ballot a week before the election. It could show up on your registrar's office a week later because your postage and your mail is actually not processed in your county, but in another county. Let's let that go away. Let's make sure your election that your ballot is counted postmarked on or before Election Day. And finally, because there's so much confusion, let community organizations pick up ballots. Make sure that the community organizations are certified by the Secretary of State. In Arizona, they have those programs. In other states, they have those programs. We're not reinventing the wheel. This is all information and all process that has been done for the last 30, 40 years. Let's continue to do it, but let's be good citizens. Make sure we're holding our government accountable, and let's make sure we're all playing by the same rules.
You say we're not reinventing the wheel, but in a weird way, it feels like we are reinventing the wheel. When I think back to voting in my first few election cycles as a teenager and a young man, the idea that somebody would have to wait for 3 hours to vote just seemed ridiculous. It seemed ludicrous. And yet, it's a part and parcel, a normal event in our election coverage now to do pan shots with long snaking lines that go on for blocks. Add 6 feet of spacing and it's going to go all the way across town. Kristen, Clarke, something's wrong. Isn't something just basically wrong if that happens every election cycle now?
When you compare the United States to other modern democracies across the globe, we have one of the lowest voter participation and turnout rates in the world. It's disgraceful. And in 2020, we want the United States to be a model when it comes to access to democracy. And we're not in part because there are operatives and forces out there that continue to drive forth voter suppression efforts that are unnecessary. You mentioned earlier vote fraud, which is often touted as an excuse for why we need to impose unnecessary, burdensome, costly barriers and restrictions on people trying to vote. And the reality is that vote fraud is not widespread or significant or in any way justifies the tremendous burden that we impose on people when we push these voter suppression tactics. Texas, on the day that the Supreme Court issued that Shelby County decision, the state of Texas announced that it was moving forth with a restrictive photo ID law. And on the day that that law took effect, there were literally hundreds of thousands of eligible voters who were disenfranchised merely because they didn't have government-issued photo ID in their back pockets. These were people who didn't have driver's licenses because they are poor and rely on public transportation. These are people who are homeless. These are people who never have flown on a plane, so don't have passports, and all of those people were literally disenfranchised. Through litigation, we were able to soften the law and take out some of the sting, but we have to ask ourselves, why? Why do we make it so hard to vote in our country? And we do that because again, our elections in so many places across the country come down to these very razor thin margins, and people wouldn't push voter suppression if it didn't work, if it didn't, stand the potential to impact or distort an outcome. It's kind of the sad, unfortunate reality about where we are in 2020. The pandemic has only complicated the picture further, but I think it's also a rallying cry for people who care, for communities that care about the right to vote, who desire a democracy where everyone has voice, who feel like, hey, to have confidence in the outcome of an election, I want to know that everyone had their shot to have their say at the ballot box. And so there is something for all of us to do right now. Now is the time for us to speak up. Maria Teresa brought up the bill introduced by Senator Klobuchar. There's also been another bill introduced by Senator Harris. There's a full court press right now to make sure states have the funding they need to put in place the reforms that can modernize democracy. Funding for the United States Postal Service, right? Because if the U.S. Postal Service can't do their job this season, then we're really in trouble, and so much more. So call Congress, 202-224-3121. 202-224-3121. That's one small step that you can take today to make sure that these critical federal bills make their way to the finish line. The other thing that you can do is to call our election protection hotline.
This is the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection hotline, 866 Our Vote. Make sure everyone in your network, everyone in your community has that number and can use it as a place to get real-time information about how to get registered, how to vote, how to request an absentee ballot in your state, but also it's a place where you can sound an alarm and report voter suppression tactics that may be emerging in your community.
Maria Teresa, we're just about at the end of our time. What should we be watching for? By definition, the audience for this conversation are people who are interested in this topic. Where are the important battlegrounds? What are the canaries in the coal mine for voter rights that people should be watching for the next 5 months?
I would say one of the things that we should be looking for is making sure that people are registering, that they're voting, that we're providing under COVID, the CARES Act and the HEROES Act, that we're providing people with the states with the funding they need in order to protect themselves. We are roughly about 150 days outside of the election. We have time right now. Make sure as an individual voter that your own voter registration is up to date, and that your friends and family are registered to vote. If you ask me what the hot spots are, we're looking at Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Kristen earlier mentioned that Texas. The reason all eyes are on Texas is because you have roughly 3.5 million unregistered youth who, if they cast a ballot, can change the course, not just of that state, but the rest of the country. 2.5 million of them, right, who are unregistered Latino youth. When people say, well, what can we do? We need to register them to vote, because we know that when people are registered, close to 75% of new registered voters come out because they're excited about the process. They want to try it out. They want to kick the tires. Our challenge is closing that voter registration gap. 123 million Americans sat it out in the last election, in the presidential, because they said that their vote didn't matter. Well, look, it's a new dawn, but I'm not sure it's the one that we want. So make sure that, yes, when people are saying, this is hard, would the system ever change? I remind people that even though we had a really difficult time waking up on Wednesday of November of the presidential election, in the midterm election, we saw the highest participation in our nation's history in 100 years for a midterm. And us as Americans collectively voted in the most diverse Congress that our nation has ever seen. And that diversity paid off. We have over 400 pieces of legislation that's a blueprint for the American future. In that, it was modernization of our election systems. We had equal pay. We had pay equity regardless of who you loved. You could not be discriminated against. We had a modernization of background checks in over 25 years. We had a refresher on what a Green New Deal looks like. We even had DACA and TAPA part of the program. So when people say my vote doesn't matter, I encourage people to look at what happened when millions of Americans went out and voted in our midterm. And we saw the most diverse, youngest LGBTQ veterans, a house that actually looked like our house in America. So I encourage people to not only register, make sure that they're up to date, keep looking at the elections, but more importantly, call your elected officials to make sure that they are fully funding the Protect Your Vote legislation in the HEROES Act, fully funded. Because the only way we win is to make sure that that the states have the resources, and then make sure that within those states that everybody's playing by the same rules.
Maria Teresa Kumar is the president and CEO of Voto Latino, and Kristen Clarke is the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Great to talk to you both.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you for having me. If you care about criminal justice issues, if you care about the schools and the quality of education that kids are receiving in your community, if you care about access to fair housing and gentrification, if you care about jobs and economic justice, then this is why you got to get out and vote. This is why I vote. The right to vote is central in our democracy, and it is the way in which we can give voice to every issue that has impact on our day-to-day lives.
So I vote for all those who can't, whether they're a child, whether there's someone in your family that is ineligible. It's important for us to exercise our participation for our personal responsibility, for our country, for our community, and for our family. Regístrate, ve a votar. Yo voto porque es importante para votar para la gente que no puede representarse, sea mis hijos, sea mi familia, sea mi vecino. Ve a votar en el 2020.
From time to time, people have said to me, well, you shouldn't vote. You're a reporter. It's not fair. But I didn't give up my American citizenship when I put a press card in my pocket. Another thing people tell me is that, well, if you don't vote, you can't complain. That's not true. You can always complain. You're an American citizen. You have the right to complain. But the vote is your form of complaint. It's how you let the people who work for you know whether they're doing a good job and whether you want them to keep their jobs or hire somebody new. So vote.
We certainly have a great challenge ahead. And as we depart from this gathering and prepare to go out and do the work we've been called to do, I'm reminded of the words of William Sloane Coffin when he said, "The world is too dangerous for anything but truth, and too small for anything but love." It is in that spirit that I leave you with this Franciscan benediction. And it simply says, "May God bless us with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that we may live deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice and oppression and exploitation of people, so that we may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and turn their pain into joy. And may God bless us with enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in this world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done. Please remember to vote in November. Keep the faith. God bless."
Hi, my name is Matthew Whitaker. I am honored to perform again for the Justice Aid. The song I will be doing is a song written by Oscar Peterson during the Civil Rights Movement. This song is called "Hymn to Freedom."
not strong, I'll be your friend. I'll help you carry on, for it won't be long till I'm gonna need somebody to lean on. Just call me